Thank you for tuning in to the Creative Strings podcast. This is episode 29 with Janet Orenstein. Hello, and welcome to the Creative Strings podcast. I'm Christian Howes, violinist, educator, and music business entrepreneur. I hope these interviews will inspire you to be creative in your life, in your art, in your business, in every way. So without further ado, let's get to it. My guest today, Janet Orenstein, shares a really fascinating and personal story regarding how she incurred a debilitating injury, how that affected her, and a lot of the surprising discoveries that she made. I met her in Winston-Salem when I was down at University of North Carolina School of the Arts to do some workshops, and I'll be returning there this summer. And you should definitely consider the Summer Strings program, and that's at UNC sa.edu. It's going to be the third week of July, and that's following on the heels of two other summer camps. The first week, of course, the Creative Strings Workshop in Columbus, Ohio, and the second week, which will be the Asheville Creative Strings Extension. Fun fact, Winston-Salem, North Carolina is not that far from Durham, North Carolina, and Durham is where the Electric Violin Shop is based. Electric Violin Shop is a sponsor of this podcast, and the reason that I recommend them to everybody, any kind of string players, the biggest reason is because of their phone support. I get questions from violinists and string players about gear, going electric, pickups, amps, all the time, like 2 or 3 times a week. And I always just tell them, go to electricviolinshop.com and look for their phone number and give them a call, because they'll sit there on the phone with you and they'll answer all of your questions. They're awesome. Make sure when you do speak with them to ask them about the line of Yamaha electric strings. Because if you know anything about me, you know that I use Yamaha. I depend on Yamaha. Creative string players depend on Yamaha. I want to thank Yamaha and Electric Violin Shop for sponsoring the Creative Strings podcast. I really hope you enjoy today's episode with Janet Orenstein. Janet Orenstein, thank you so much for joining me and sharing with us at the Creative Strings podcast. I'm really happy to see you again.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I really am fascinated by the story that I heard from you the other day when we were at lunch, when I was visiting University of North Carolina School of the Arts in Winston-Salem. Got to work with your wonderful students, a wonderful program. Looking forward to coming back next summer and working with them. I think it's the third week of July, and people can certainly check that out. But I would love for you to share your story, because it was really inspiring on many levels to me. I think it's a unique story that we can get a lot from. So I wonder if you'd be willing to start with the same place that you started when you shared the story with me, which was during or beginning or right as you were getting ready to start your tour in Africa. Was this, 15, 20 years ago?
Oh, well, it was in 1996. It was in April and May of 1996, so you can do the math. It was more than 20 years ago.
And what happened?
Well, I was on a lot of recommended vaccinations and also an anti-malarial medication called mefloquine, which, as it turns out, is a pretty serious drug that has some major side effects, and you probably shouldn't be on it for more than a couple of weeks. And my pianist and I were on it for about 9 or 10 weeks. And we had all sorts of symptoms together. We would laugh about it. We'd get a migraine headache every time we took it. We would have horrible death dreams and, wouldn't be able to sleep. We'd sleep maybe an hour a night. She ended up having panic attacks, and I ended up having a sort of weird, aside from just incredible fatigue and insomnia, a weird thing happened to my left hand where it just started to feel a little sluggish. And when I would play the fast passages, I felt slightly less coordinated, but I could still pull off everything. And I guess being young and whatever, I kind of ignored it. When I got back from Africa, I had a fairly relaxing summer. We ended up moving to Charlottesville that summer, and I went back to New York to give a final doctoral recital. And I was playing a fast movement of solo Bach, and felt the same kind of, I don't know, a sort of malaise almost in trying to coordinate my left hand. And so I decided to take a lesson with my old teacher and said, would you please watch me play this and what's going on? And she said, that's not your hand. You really better get to a doctor. She said, I've never seen you look like that. And it started to feel like I couldn't lift my third finger. And it just wasn't flowing. It just wasn't coordinated. So I got through the recital. I got my degree. And I went on tour and played a ton of concerts that fall. Did maybe 5 or 6 premieres with my piano trio. Every time I played, it was getting a little bit worse, but I didn't really have time to deal with it. I did go to a hand surgeon who sent me to neurologists. And I think that fall I got checked out to make sure I didn't have MS or something really horrible. And everything seemed to be fine. All my nerves were working properly. So nobody really had any advice except to try to get some rest. And then that December, I got pregnant. And when I was on tour in my first couple months of pregnancy, my hand completely fell apart. And for the last concert on the tour, I took my 2 colleagues aside and said, I can't play. I don't know if I can even get through this concert. And they said, really? Is it that bad? And I said, really, it is. Just watch. And there was dead silence in the room after I attempted to play something. And I'll never forget my pianist just said, okay, just play repeated notes, the same note on repeated bows. Don't play any of the passage work in the Mozart. And we'll take out all repeats. Let's just get through this concert, just get through the concert. And I did that basically and spent the rest of the pregnancy really, really worried and deteriorating. The internet was just, sort of a beginning thing at that point. And I did a little research or whatever research I could and diagnosed myself with focal dystonia. But I was already at that point about 8 or 9 months pregnant. And so I had the baby, beautiful first child, my son. And then I went up to NIH and attempted to play the violin for a team of neurologists who were doing a study on focal dystonia. And they confirmed my diagnosis and they wanted me in their study. And I said no because it involved Botox. And I really, really, really wanted them to help me, but I didn't want to put Botox in my body if I was nursing a newborn child. So I declined that offer, but it was really the beginning of a kind of nightmare period in my life because I basically woke up and had lost all my skill on the violin altogether. I really couldn't coordinate even 2 notes. And in the beginning, after that tour, my left hand I'd wake up with it in a fist like this, and I'd have to use my other hand just to open it because I couldn't even find the muscles. Like I couldn't find the muscles with my brain to release my hand. It really did feel like somebody else's hand was on the end of my arm, like I had a stroke or something weird like that. I continued to see doctors and I went to every kind of alternative practitioner that you could name. I probably threw about $10,000 at it in the first 8 or 9 months, after my son was born. And really just had to cancel concerts and withdraw from my musical life. My manager at the time said, don't tell anybody. Because nobody likes, people like to talk about musicians with hand problems and you'll never get another concert, which was ironic since I couldn't actually play another concert. So I was kind of lonely too. I withdrew and followed her advice, but was just really kind of devastated. So I didn't really know what to do. What I ended up doing was over time with a lot of, through a lot of tears and a lot of, painful practice sessions, I allowed myself to move however I possibly could on the violin, which for about 6 years meant using only 2 fingers because I couldn't actually move my third and fourth fingers. So they would curl beneath the fingerboard, and I would actually get around pretty remarkably well with a lot of practice with my only two fingers. And my technique, of course, changed dramatically. I mean, there wasn't a violin lesson I had in my life that would have prepared me for the fingerings I was using. And my music looked kind of like computer code. It was like a lot of O's and ones and twos. Um, but I did that for about 6 years. And after my second child was born, I miraculously, the other two fingers started to float up a little bit, and I was able to use them sparingly. If I used my third finger, I had to like give it a long time to recover before I could use it again. So yeah, it just took my brain a long time to be able to lift the finger up after it was down. So it was really, yeah, it was really crazy. And performing was really, naturally changed my mindset tremendously. I would go out on stage with like 4 sets of fingerings over various passages because I never knew what my hand was going to want to do that day. Sometimes I would come up with a great fingering, and then the next day I couldn't do it. So it was definitely painstaking work. When I moved to Greensboro, when my second child was 6 weeks old, I was asked to play the Greensboro Symphony, and I said no. I just was just too afraid, actually, to do it. I didn't think could really pull it off. And finally, after a lot of nagging, the personnel director convinced me that I should do it, and I said, "Please put me in the very back of the second violin section." And I just memorized my part. I basically I didn't dare write any of my fingerings in the music because I thought my stand partner would have a heart attack if he saw them. So, I just basically would memorize my music, and I did that for years actually in the Greensboro Symphony. Uh, they did put me in the first violin section, which did make me very nervous, but I just practiced for hours probably on stuff that I would have been able to sight read quite easily before. So it was a real lesson for me. I've always been a kind of molto allegro person. I mean, it gets me into trouble driving. I've had to really learn to use cruise control. And yeah, that's kind of my inner tempo. And I've always been really quick at learning things. So I was sort of facile in a way, and almost maybe glibly so. So this was a total change for me. I had to spend hours and hours figuring out fingerings for maybe 5 or 6 notes sometimes. So it was very humbling, and it really it changed my personality completely, I would have to say.
How did it change your
Um,
personality?
well, it it made me immediately more compassionate a person, um, for anybody who struggled in any way with anything, and especially for old people, for people who lose movement. At the time, I guess I was in my 30s. When my first child was born, I had just turned 33. So this was happening all through my 30s and 40s. And I had some I had some dear friends who were elderly at the time, former students of mine, amateur students, and other people in my life, my grandmother. And I think I think when you're young, sometimes you just try not to notice that it's hard to be old. The old people, you just don't relate to them in a certain way and what they're going through. And I suddenly really felt what they were going through if they couldn't move so easily, or just any kind of loss of movement. Um, it really did sort of slow me down tremendously in my own work. It made it so that with my teaching, I could just pick up the violin and demonstrate. I used to do that probably way too much. As a teacher, I had to learn how not to do that, and how to explain and demonstrate only very sparingly so that I could actually uh, help my students,
Why do you
and not
think that?
distract them.
Why do you think you used to do it too much, demonstrating? How did it
Because
change
I
your?
love to play, and it was fun. And so I think sometimes it's easier to say, no, just do it like this, and that's not always so bad, by the way. It's very helpful for students to hear how something, should go. So I'm not suggesting that that teachers should not demonstrate. I think it's very important. It's a very important part of teaching, and it was hard for me to not have that at my fingertips. But I do think that you can sometimes do it too much and not spend enough time analyzing exactly what the student is struggling with.
Okay.
Yeah, so it did change me as a teacher in that
So
way.
did that make you a better teacher because you were demonstrating as a result of not knowing how to teach in other ways? So then you had to learn how to teach better or in other ways?
Yeah, that's what I would say. I would say it definitely made me have to analyze things and explain things and use verbal explanations. Um, it made me more curious about what the student was feeling and what they were experiencing. So it just changed my entire approach to movement in general. The other thing that changed, of course, a big thing in my life that changed was um, I was attempting to do a sort of OT that was based on a study across the country in San Francisco. This researcher named Nancy Beal was doing research on dystonia, taking a really different approach from the people at NIH. Her approach was this is a train wreck in the brain, and it's probably a distorted sensory feedback loop that makes the whole mapping of your hand kind of crazy, and your brain is operating with a faulty map of your hand. So if you got into this mess, you could get out of this mess. You could, the plasticity of the brain would enable it to rewire itself yet again and heal itself. And I just say, intuitively, that felt like that could happen for me. I felt like, how did this happen? I'm completely fine. My nerves work completely well. There's something weird. I need a reboot of some kind so that I can train my hand again. People would say to me, just practice, just retrain your hand. But it didn't work that way, because unfortunately it was all happening like at the brainstem level. So before I could actually control a movement, the whole hand would go into a spaz and fingers would pop up, others would curl. There was no actual way in to control the movement.
So
It
your
was
brain,
just,
you had some form of brain damage. Would that be correct?
I would say it was yeah, I think it does make sense that there was a sensory feedback loop distortion, so that somehow the mapping that you work from, I mean, you're really creating your body all the time. It happens. If you were living on a boat, you would learn how to balance on that boat, and then when you get back on land, you have sea legs. I mean, your body is always changing itself. If you turn yourself upside down, eventually you're going to see right side up. There's a lot of interpretation that happens, and there's a lot of feedback that we get from the world that helps us to understand our own bodies, our own physical manifestation. I think that is accurate.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I feel that even though I can play probably at 80 to 90%, my hand really functions amazingly well right now. I'm always amazed every time I pick up a violin. Um, I still feel like I can activate the dystonia, that it's still there, that there is still sometimes this confusion at certain tempos. So I think that's correct. I think that's correct. But I also do feel that when I went to my OT with these exercises from this researcher, she looked at me and said,
Occupational
"You,
therapist?
yeah, occupational therapist." She said, "You need a complete system reboot. You need to do Shavasana." I had no idea what Shavasana was. And when she put me in Shavasana, I was
Yoga.
furious.
Yoga, right?
Yeah, it's yoga, right? It's actually corpse pose, yeah. I was furious. I was angry at her. I thought, this isn't going to get me to play the violin. I was so mad. But she was actually right. I really did need to slow down and allow my own nervous system to reboot in many ways. And it's taken 20 years. I mean, it was 17 years before I was able to play a recital.
So how
So
many years were you so severely impaired that you couldn't even really play beyond using two fingers?
I used two fingers for something like 6 or 7 years, but I actually was pretty good at it. So people, um, people didn't even really notice. I know that's so weird to say that, but we had that conversation, you and I, about that. I said, a lot of times when people play with you, they're not really looking at you. They're absorbed in themselves. So I think I became a really, really good faker, is how I would describe myself. It was just fake ondo all the time, and it wasn't nearly as good playing as it could have been if I had full use of my hand, of course.
So just to clarify,
But
though, I mean, for the listeners too, I mean, from what I understand, you got a doctorate, you studied at Juilliard, you had a
yeah,
manager as a solo concertizing concert soloist violinist, like you were like really the top of the top of the top.
my manager was for my chamber music group for my piano trio that I played with, and we were playing concerts all over the place. So that was absolutely wonderful. And I had won a competition and won a solo tour in Africa. So I, I think my career, I think my career was it was going uphill when this happened. Let's put it that
Well,
way.
what I mean though is that
Yeah.
you had the opportunity to be concertizing in the classical world, touring around the world with a manager, having graduated from Juilliard. I mean, to most people, 99.99% of people, that is like the upper echelon. And so it's a very, I mean, to me, it strikes me as a very dramatic and humbling. I don't even know if that's the right word, but you said that you were facile or that you were a quick learner, but that's obviously a humble way of saying that you were the best at what you did always from an early age. You had the best teachers, you were the most advanced in every class, the youngest, the quickest, the fastest, the most envied. And all of a sudden you couldn't play. So how did that mess with your head?
Oh, it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. I lived in a house with my two colleagues in my trio. One was my husband, and they would practice. We all, it was a big house. We had each of us had our own areas to practice. And when they practiced, I would walk. It was in Charlottesville near Monticello, and I would walk down the road to this farm, a vineyard that happened to have some cows on it on the field. And I would sit with the cows for hours because I couldn't bear to be in the house while they were practicing. It was just too painful. Um, it was horrible for me. I don't really like to revisit it um, because it really was such an awful time for me. I think there wasn't anything that I did when I didn't know what I had lost, that I had lost all skill. And for a musician or anybody who has done something for a very long time, that was who I was. That was my whole identity. It was a really hard thing for me to feel like I was worthy of anything without that ability to play the violin. I couldn't go to the drugstore and buy toothpaste without feeling somehow diminished as a person. It really just was a ubiquitous feeling. So I had a good therapist. I don't know what else to tell you. I did a lot of meditation retreats. I did a lot of silent meditation retreats, and I did a lot of therapy, and I eventually was able to give myself permission to not be the best, to not be even very good, to actually suck, and be really, really experimental and say, what happens if I hold my other fingers with my right hand and then try to do this with this finger? Or, I mean, I really went down to very, very basic experimental movements. I allowed myself to not look like a Julliard-trained violinist, to have a hand position that was horrific looking. But if I could play, then that's what I did. And I have to be honest with you, it was a hard fought battle to give myself permission to do those things, because I was brought up in the kind of environment where, you didn't change notes if you couldn't play them. It's really different from the kind of freedom that you have. Um, and you wouldn't rewrite Beethoven just to make the figuration easier. But I did. I said, you know what? He's dead. He's not going to be at the concert. And it's the same chord. So I did.
Well, I would imagine that if you're in that situation, eh, forgive me for trying to, I don't want to speak for you, your experience. I can't relate to it really, but I would imagine that you would also have to derive your own self worth from things aside from being a great Juilliard-trained, quote unquote, great Juilliard-trained violinist, like being a mom or being, having relationships and people around you. Um, is that true, or were there other things that you derived more satisfaction and a sense of contribution and importance from?
Absolutely. I mean, I really don't know. Um, I don't know what my life would have been like had I not had a child actually at the same time that this all happened. And you have this little baby who doesn't know that you play the violin and certainly doesn't care whether you have dystonia. you know and it was just a complete love affair from the beginning, and I really felt so grateful. I would just wake up and just feel so grateful that I had this little baby. um you know it 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 wasn't like an overnight thing. It wasn't like I suddenly was, well, I used to be a violinist and now I'm going to be something else. Now it doesn't really work that way. It's a bit of a journey. At this point, I don't know what I am and I don't really care. So, um, I think it's been an open question for so long. But I will say that yoga made a big difference for me in my life. And I actually would credit, if there's one thing that I did that I would credit for helping my body and mind heal and get me back, to where I am now as a violinist, it would be the yoga, even though I can't exactly explain exactly how that works. Um,
What's the feeling that yoga gives you?
the first time I walked into a yoga class, I was 35. I had had dystonia already for a couple of years, and my OT was trying to get me to do yoga, but I wasn't listening to her. I was stubborn, and I had a baby, and I just didn't do it. And I guess it wasn't expensive enough. I think at that point I was spending way too much money on alternative things. So at some point I did walk into a yoga class in Charlottesville. It was an Iyengar class, and it was a Wednesday morning class, and they were discussing triangle pose, and they were practicing in so many different ways. They were just examining, let's say, the front leg and triangle pose, and it was so detailed and so like it was so interesting. It really was practicing, and I hadn't been able to practice. I missed practicing more than anything. I missed practicing, and I mean, I remember just saying, a deal with God. It's okay with me if I never play another concert for the rest of my life, as long as I'm able to practice again. I missed practicing so much. So I walked into this yoga class and I felt like I was practicing again.
Wow.
Like I was mentally engaged, and it was like the kind of experimentation that I missed being able to do. And I really fell in love with it. I remember leaving the class and sitting in my car and just crying. I couldn't believe it.
Is it because it
So
gives you like a stillness and a focal point that practicing gives you? Is that why it gives you a center to focus on? Um,
I think it might have been that style of yoga too, which is actually fairly intellectual in some ways. But it gave me something to think about, and I felt like I was learning something.
got it.
I felt like I was changing and learning something.
Well, because yoga, one of the things about yoga to me that strikes me, because I've just been doing it a little bit for the last year or two, is the mantras and the sort of like the other day when I was there, she said, think about what you're focused on in the practice. And if you can't think about anything else, just think about the phrase, I am enough. And that sounds like something that you maybe had to struggle with, or
It's true. That's really beautiful, actually. I mean, some of my some of my most wonderful yoga experiences was when I felt when I was in a state of absorption, I would say, when I was very focused on what I was doing and very in touch with my own experience of what I was doing, whether it was through the breath or through sensations in the body. And that's the kind of thing that I would do when I would practice the violin. I mean, I guess I practiced so many hours in my life that kind of absorption came more easily because I was more accomplished. It didn't come quite so easily in yoga, right away, but I could see that this was what practicing yoga could offer me. That concentration, mental concentration, and um, definitely a kind of meditative focusing on the breath.
What about self-acceptance, though?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's so much easier for me in yoga. I mean, you know, I wasn't judgmental. I remember sitting with those cows in the field and thinking to myself, why do I care that I can't move my left hand on the violin? I don't care that I can't play tennis. I go out on a tennis court and I suck. And it's okay.
Right.
I don't care about that. My whole ego, my entire being and identity isn't wrapped up in being a tennis player. So what is this thing that is making me suffer so much with regards to what I've lost on the violin? I really was curious, genuinely curious about what is this identity thing? What is it? And absolutely, you're absolutely right. It was much easier for me to be non-judgmental in practicing yoga, and it was just the joy of learning something in that state. It filled a kind of space that had been empty at that point in my life. So
I want to take a quick sec to thank our sponsors, Yamaha and Electric Violin Shop. If you know about me, you know that I've worked with Yamaha for over 20 years now, and there are lots of reasons. Their electric string line is the best, in my opinion, and their acoustic string line is amazing as well. I really want to thank Yamaha for their support. I also want to thank Electric Violin Shop. If you go to electricviolinshop.com/creative strings, you can let them know that I sent you and you'll get a discount if you purchase something. Or if not, if you just have a question you want to ask them, you'll see their phone number right there. Give them a call about anything, any questions related to electric string playing. Could be pickups, amps, effects, electric violins, electric cellos, that sort of thing. And just one other important announcement. It really is time right now to plan for summer. I want to make sure you know about the Creative Strings Workshop. That's the first week of July in Columbus, Ohio. It is the summer conference for creative string players worldwide. I want you to come and join us and experience this week. It's been a labor of love for me for 16 years now, and there's almost nothing that makes me happier. So if you have questions, reach out to me at chris@christianhouse.com or just look up the Creative Strings Workshop.
So for many years, if I remember correctly, you told me that you really kept this a secret from like everybody except maybe like your husband or a couple people or something, right?
I did, because of what my manager had told me years before, even though she was no longer my manager. She wasn't wrong. If I was hoping to heal and get better, if it got out there that I had a serious hand problem, nobody would hire me. So, of course, after a certain point, it was sort of hilarious to me that, why am I keeping this a secret? I already have no career. I've already given it all up. It's already gone. The time has passed. I'm now an old lady. So, it just seems so ridiculous to me. And so, it felt like some kind of obstacle between me and my friends that I played music with, that I knew in Greensboro Symphony, or that I, had been at school with, or, anybody in music. It didn't seem to make sense to me to keep this a secret anymore.
I'm assuming that there was a dream attached to your concertizing and getting through Juilliard and, getting a manager and having a chamber group. I mean, those are the kinds of things that people dream about and work towards for a very, very long time. And I'm assuming that that was true of you. So, and you referenced this earlier, but you said that it's just been an open question for 20 years. But I just want to push back on that because I'm wondering, like, has there been a dream that's taken over, like a new dream, like the dream of being a mom, the dream of being a teacher, the dream of contributing to your community and to people that you love and, in the world in a different way? Is it really an open question, or is there a way for you to find some fullness and some purpose and that's as explicit as the original dream you had was?
That's a beautiful question, actually. And these things always evolve. I don't know
Right.
if there was a moment when any decisions were really made, but I guess probably over time I did let go of the career. It still can make me sad to think of the things I've let go of. The jobs that I had to pass up and the contracts I had to turn down and things like that. Um, and yes, I really, really loved just being a mom for a very long time and just struggling on my own and practicing on my own with the little movement that I had and playing in Greensboro. Often being asked to play chamber music with old friends and colleagues and people who didn't know that my hand wasn't working, but had known me from before, and I'd sort of squeak by and do my best faking that I possibly could in the second violin seat, in a chamber group, and really actually loved doing that, and always really loved playing music and performing. And then I was lucky enough to my husband works at UNCSA. He's a cellist, and they needed an interim violinist for 1 year while they conducted a search, and they asked me if I would be the interim teacher for that year, and I said of course. And I decided I would try to play a recital again. So that was kind of my coming out recital. And I told you about this, how I was had to send in a bio for this program, and I just felt like such a liar when I was writing this bio, and I'm leaving out like the elephant in the room. So I decided, I need to tell the truth already. This is silly. It's been 17 years. So anyway, the way that ended up happening was a big article came out in the News and Record, and then I played the recital, and it was a very big success. And they hired that year. They had an incredible violinist come for the position named Ida Bieler from Germany. She's just a remarkable musician, violinist, and pedagogue. And I heard her masterclass and just thought, oh, this woman is phenomenal. I would love to study with her. And then at the same time, she really wasn't. Everybody wanted her for the job, but she wasn't able to completely give up her commitments in Europe. So I was asked if I would be her assistant, which to me was like a dream, really like a dream come true. So I didn't sit down and write this dream out. It kind of happened thanks to many things, thanks to my husband, I suppose, and thanks to many other people that have helped me. And we hit it off. For me, it's like getting my second, third, and fourth doctorates in pedagogy. It really is quite amazing working with her.
And I just want to make a mention, Ida Bieler, right?
Yes.
Ida Bieler is at University of North Carolina School of the Arts, which is a private school, boarding school for high school kids, but it's also a conservatory for undergraduate students, as far as I understand.
It absolutely is. And actually for North Carolina residents, it is a free boarding school. So it is really kind of unique in many ways. There aren't too many places like this. It isn't easy to get in as a high school student because there aren't that many openings. It's a small school, but it is free for all North Carolina residents if they get in
Is
in
it
high
the same
school.
kind of school as the North Carolina School of Science and Math?
It is actually,
Because
yes.
my friend
Except that it
Scott
has a college, except that it's really,
got it.
part of
Because
the university system.
my friend Scott Laird teaches orchestra
Yes, I
at,
know Scott.
and Scott was on this podcast actually. Um, so, well, I didn't know that, but the reason I wanted to bring it up is because Ida Beeler is also going to be teaching for a week this summer, the second
Hmm.
week of July, prior to the week that I'll be there. So you're going to be
That's
doing
right.
one full week with Ida Beeler and then one full week with me. Uh,
That's right.
and as far as I understand, this is open to. Can anybody attend this from? They don't have to be in college. I mean, I'm just curious.
It's so funny because I actually think that I'm needing to have a conversation with my dean about this because originally we wanted this to be only open for high school students, but we're getting so much interest from not only college students, but even the community at large that, I'm feeling that we need to sort of have a more creative enrollment,
Well, update me about
procedure.
that so I can let everybody know that's listening, so
I
we can.
absolutely will. It's
Okay.
called Summer Strings at UNCSA, so
Okay.
check it out on the
All right.
website.
All right. Good.
Ida will be doing a week of master classes and what she likes to call audition prep. So it is actually wonderful for high school juniors and seniors, anybody actually in high school, to get them ready for college auditions. But you know, you can do audition prep all the time.
Got it. Well,
So
can I wonder if it's okay for me to pivot really quickly. I mean, I had you said perhaps facetiously earlier that, once you got dystonia, um, you you weren't a great violinist anymore, and in fact you sucked. Um, and I wonder, my question is, have you, I mean, obviously there's certain measurable things, like maybe your vibrato, you can't control your vibrato as well as you used to, or you can't nail your intonation as often as you used to, or you can't play as accurately or shift as effortlessly. Like those things are measurable, right? But that's different than saying great and sucking. Or I guess my question is it? Because to me,
that's a good, yeah,
you
another
know,
good question. I know what you're saying. And look, the artistry on the violin comes from the bow arm. So I did always feel, in fact, as I had to play with fewer fingers, I actually, in some ways, became better with my bow arm. It became more subtle, and I was able to really enable myself to get away with things in a sense because of my bowing. But if you can't really play any of the notes, it does you reduce things
but
quite
there's
a
something
bit.
beyond that though in music.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, maybe I'm disagreeing with you here, but I'm going to disagree with you. Um, and I
Yeah.
think my change from, strictly classical to then learning about other styles of music, it made me question the notion of what it is to suck versus what it is to be a great musician. And I mean, you know, uh, I mean, and part of this came for me by playing, frankly, with other musicians on a prison yard, musicians who learned completely self-taught, who could only play a few notes sometimes, but they were saying something. And so I know it
Yeah.
sounds to people like us who had, or especially like you, who had the highest levels of elite training, it can seem like a little bit of a paying lip service. But the more that I get into this zone, the less it's lip service, and it's the more that I believe that there's a soul that people can bring into the music that transcends our technical ability at times. I'm wondering if you agree with that or not.
I do agree with it, and I think it was my own journey in a way, my own struggle with the whole notion of who I was and the kind of violinist that I thought that I needed to be, the kind of player that I would respect, that I wasn't anymore. I mean, there was definitely some amount of, well, a large amount of judgment,
Can that be revised though? Can
self-judgment.
your values change though? I mean,
Yeah.
are you still judging according to the 23-year-old self or the 28-year-old self?
Oh, no, 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 not at all.
I mean, can you hear more in music? I mean, as a teacher,
Yeah.
also, isn't part of the journey as a teacher? I mean, let me
Well,
frame it a
first of all, I
different.
don't believe it when somebody says they can't do something. That's one thing that's totally true because it's just not true. You can do it with one finger.
Well, how many students do you have at UNCSA right now? 12?
15,
15.
15, some, yeah.
Okay. So, wouldn't you say that you hear beyond each of those 15 students, you hear beyond their limitations in the sense of like their soul coming through the music, the beauty. Don't you hear the beauty in what they have, regardless of if they play as fast or as perfectly? Don't you hear something that's special about each one of those students?
Oh, absolutely. Everybody's different. People develop differently though too. So there are sometimes times where I hear somebody play and I think they go through a self-conscious stage and they're not really expressing themselves or really enjoying themselves so much. And then maybe a year later, that's completely different because everybody's always changing and growing, and especially when you're working with very young people. But absolutely, everybody's different, and yeah, I love hearing that. I love hearing the really neat, amazing things about each of these students. I'll hear them play and think, God, I wish I had that vibrato. God, I wish I could do that. I mean, it's really fun. I mean, it's really fun just to see what people are blessed with, and how they're inclined to express themselves. That's just.
What about the notion of technique? Because I would think that this would also change the idea about what it means to have technique. I mean, you revised your technique, you completely reinvented your technique. Do you have a different opinion about what it means to say the word technique now?
Technique for me has always meant how do you do something. That's all it's ever really meant for me. And so it's like the hooker by crook. It could be the hooker by crook technique, which is what you have if you're working with dystonia, or it could be the more classically trained, perfect, beautiful Juilliard technique that you might maybe were taught from the age of 3. It doesn't make sense in a certain way to have technique and not be a musician, does it? I mean, not have something that you're saying, then I don't even know what that is, to be honest. I mean, that's not to say that you don't have to know how to do certain things on the violin. We practice these things, and we have etudes, and we practice how to make a beautiful sound doing this or that, and different bow strokes. I have to figure out what I want to do first before I know how I'm going to do it. So the frustration with having dystonia was that the way that I would have done it before wasn't available to me. And so that loomed over me for a very long time. And once I was able gradually, again, this didn't happen overnight by any stretch, gradually that receded, that expectation of I would have been able to do this before, this would have been so easy, I could have done it like such and such. And instead of thinking about that, I just got to work and said, okay, this is my hand. This is what it can do. How am I going to get this to work? How can I make this work? How can I do what I want to do with the hand that I have? So once I was doing that, it was all practicing again. It was all the same as it had always been, And so even with a compromised hand, I was happy practicing. Once I could let go of some of the judgment, against that.
So what's your dream now? What do you see and what are you looking forward to?
I want to play Bach again. I want to play all the movements of Bach. I can do many of them, but I've only started practicing Bach for the past 2-3 years. So, and I would love to be able to get to do the whole book again. That's my personal dream right now, and I'm really curious about the stuff that you taught me at your little workshop during our intensive arts.
4 long workshops. I don't know if you could call them little.
They weren't little, actually. There was so much information inside. They were not little, actually, not at all. In fact, I really wish I had taken better notes because I try to remember everything. And
well, there's a video somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, and what about teaching? What do you look? I mean, how do you derive satisfaction as a teacher now that you do so much of it?
Oh, there's endless ways to derive satisfaction as a teacher. I love it when my students get better. I mean, and when they feel good about themselves. I really feel like that's the main thing. It's just, it's a way to transmit love. It really is. And just, helping another person and watching them get empowered by the work that they do,
Wow.
And just really grow as people. Whether they end up being, full-time musicians or part-time musicians, or that, some of them really can be at the very top of the profession, whatever they end up doing with it, it is secondary in a way, so that I love teaching. And I love teaching alongside Ida, actually, because she's just such a beautiful spirit and a very experienced teacher. So I'm learning so much just from watching her, and it's been great. So I really feel lucky, I have to say. I sometimes I wake up and can't really believe it, and if I pick up the violin, I can't really believe that I can play again. That I have full use of my hand, and I don't quite know how that happened. It happened very slowly over a long period of time. So
That's great. Well, I so appreciate you sharing, Janet, and it's really inspiring for me to hear your story. Um, I guess, yeah, I guess maybe it goes without saying, or maybe we've already covered that this experience that you had has really informed how you feel and can empathize with your students, I guess. Is that true?
yeah,
Yeah.
it absolutely is true, because everybody has physical restrictions. Actually, everybody has some kind of restriction. Whether it's, some people are very physically talented, but we all have restrictions. We all have. I mean, I have mental restrictions, and my intelligence is restricted too. It's not just that I have dystonia. I have all sorts of handicaps. So we really are just working with ourselves and who we are, and it helps me in a way, I think, to have such experience working with a really, really obvious, an obvious disability like that, an obvious restriction. It just doesn't faze me when my students have their own. We just work it out together. We just figure it out. It's just another experiment in a way, another body to experiment with, another brain and body to experiment with.
Awesome.
So,
Where can people find you? Online, or is there some place that you hang out online you want people to find you? Maybe at the school website, or maybe do you have some kind of social media website stuff, whatever?
well, we have a Summer Strings Facebook page. I have my own Facebook page. Anybody can message me on that. And of course, we do have a website for our studio, and there's lots of contact information on that.
And that would be
So,
what, uncsa.edu?
.edu. Yep.
Okay, and that's for
And
University of North Carolina School of the Arts. So just go to uncsa.edu. Look for Janet Orenstein. Look for Summer Strings, and definitely in 2018, this summer, the second week of July, the third week of July, there's going to be a lot of exciting masterclasses, and we'll link that on the show notes page at christianhouse.com. Just go to the blog and look for this. It will be easy to find. Anything else on your mind, Janet?
no, this is really fun.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're an awesome storyteller, and it's amazing. And I want to acknowledge you for everything you've gone through, and how you've been able to use it and sort of make the most of it, and everything you're doing now. And it's great. I'm really excited.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. It wasn't my choice. It was what the universe handed to me, but and I would not want anybody to get dystonia. It's not a fun thing to get, but it's also not a horrible thing, because it's not life-threatening, and there's a lot of joy in relearning to play the violin as well. So, I appreciate this. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 29. If you liked the story, if you have comments, go over to christianhouse.com. Just look for the blog and leave a comment there. Please share this episode. Reach out to me, chris@christianhouse.com, anytime. I will personally respond. Would love to know your thoughts. I want to thank our sponsors, Yamaha. We depend on Yamaha. And Electric Violin Shop. Remember, if you go to electricviolinshop.com/creative strings, and if you do purchase something, you'll get a discount. Heads up, it's time to plan for summer. I want to make sure you don't miss out on the 16th annual Creative Strings Workshop in Columbus, Ohio. It's really a labor of love for me, and it's become a very special gathering for creative string players all around the world. Go to christianhouse.com/education and you can learn about the Creative Strings Workshop, or just send me an email. If you have a question, send me an email about it. I appreciate you checking out the podcast and look forward to being in touch soon. This is Christian Howes with Creative Strings. Click the link to subscribe and watch more.